figured at this point, basically kind of giving a TLDR of my thoughts on Space Marine 2 and basically how they could improve on it, vastly improve on the gameplay itself. The game itself has some very, very kind of skewed design decisions in it, I would say. Mainly cosmetics in the game are actually probably one of the best parts of the game itself. The tools are basically there for making the game better, but as it stands right now, it is very, very limited. The classes themselves are pretty well fleshed out. Obviously, they can be improved, and this isn't really going to be a PSA on game balance, even though I usually talk about game balance when it comes to games like, let's say, Helldivers 2, right? In the case of Space Marines 2, it kind of lacks a forward-looking direction here, and one of the things we're going to get into here, one of the worst parts of the game currently is basically the gameplay loop itself, which is you play the same mission over and over and over and over again. So I was contemplating, specifically on like looking at different ways that looking at their outlook on their plan. I don't even have any plans of buying the DLC, because honestly the DLC, the season pass doesn't even make sense. So if we take a peek here at the roadmap for the game itself, and they have some plans for it, obviously. And not soon enough is the way this is going, though. So here we have the forward-looking plan for Space Marines 2, right? The game launched. Already, I'd say a lot of people have basically fallen off from the game itself. We could even take a look at the gameplay numbers here real quick on Steam just to see what it's looking like. Not that, once again, numbers are the end-all be-all of games being good or not, but usually tell you whether or not people are actually still interested in the game itself. And obviously, Space Marines 2 I'd even mark it as more of a single-player game, even though it wasn't. It was actually, the campaign itself was actually extremely, extremely short. Let's see. So since launch, obviously, you're going to see numbers fall off. That's normal. But pretty much everyone got their fill, and it'd be kind of curious. It's going to be more curious what happens here in maybe another month, so we can see actually whether or not it's retaining players, or if these are still people buying the game and basically playing it new, right? Operations themselves, well, very cool. I'm not even going to talk about PvP. PvP in Space Marines 2 is basically DOA, in my personal opinion. It is like, from what I can tell, it's kind of like Gears of War, only worse, and it just doesn't really know what it wants to be. It's like putting PvP in Helldivers 2, although, as we discussed in the Better Divers Guide, there are a lot of ways that could actually add PvP to Helldivers 2 without just making it like basically what they're doing here, which is kind of like a Halo, Space Marines versus Space Marines affair, right? In the case of Helldivers 2, we suggested, for instance, that people could actually play the special units much in the same way of Left 4 Dead. The idea is not to be a side in which you have a direct confrontation with, and there's actually a chance that one side really wins. The monsters in Left 4 Dead 2, if you guys have played it, are very, very, relatively fragile. The survivors can kill them relatively easily. It's not about necessarily even having like one wave of monsters. It's about basically slamming your head against the wall and slowing them down enough. When they swap sides, you can then beat the clock, or you even stop them from winning in the first place, right? So the ideal scenario here is basically at the end of the day is you slow them down enough where they actually like stagnate. They don't get a chance to actually get through, or just makes them waste enough time in which the other side has a chance of winning, right? They could also do the same thing in Space Marine 2 here, in which you could have a PvP mode, or PvPvE, in which players take control of major units and boss units. And the idea isn't necessarily that even you're going to necessarily win, but rather you might have a chance of slowing them down enough, and you swap sides in which one side wins, right? So even in Space Marines 2, you could apply the same system for Left 4 Dead 2, or in other games. Left 4 Dead 2 is the most prominent one that I can think of, which is not a direct confrontation system. I mean, it still is, but it's not in the same way that it's symmetrically balanced, right? Where both sides have a chance of winning. And I'd say in the case of games like this, like a Horde shooter, it actually makes a lot more sense than having something like your Halo PvP, let's all play Space Marines and try and kill each other sort of ordeal, which is what PvP is. Once again, I don't really even plan on playing PvP in any way, shape, or form. That's basically all the picture. I think a lot of people are in that boat where they don't even plan on playing it, or they have lackluster reception when they're playing it itself. So I don't even think that's actually going to be something long-term. It's PvP itself in games is definitely something that can keep games going for a long period of time. It's just like infinite amount of time is more or less the way it works, because the gameplay loop's good enough where it's actually engaging, and then you're butting heads not with AI, but rather in difficulty, the PvE, like, against the environment, but rather against players, which can change things up, right? So that's a lot of replayability games. In the case of Space Marines 2, it does not really have it going for it. And as such, that's basically off the table. They could do something, like I just suggested, which is also in the Better Divers Guide, which we've suggested for Helldivers 2. You'll see a lot of inspiration here coming into play in their current updates currently. Yeah. But, nothing to do with what we've spent an inordinate amount of time writing and talking about on stream in the 6 months that I played Helldivers 2. Once again, I'm doing this mainly because I think Space Marines 2 is actually a really cool game. The cosmetics in Space Marines 2 itself are actually phenomenal. I haven't even spent any time with them, but if you want, you can tell, first and foremost, I don't know if Games Workshop put that in play, but you can tell, first and foremost, they're trying to put into play the aspect of the tabletop where you can paint your own armies, which, Dawn of War. I'm a big fan of Warhammer, not through the tabletop, not through the books, but rather through Dawn of War. I played Dawn of War 1 and a little bit of Dawn of War 2, but I played an extensive amount of Dawn of War 1 when I was back in college. And it's one of the first games, I think the only game at the time, and still very rare, is a game with an army painter in which you can actually change the look of your units dynamically, right? You can change the accents and different parts on your characters or your army in Dawn of War. So they're trying to put first and foremost the tabletop experience of customizing your units and allowing you to actually make things that are new and unique to yourself. I can see that. It's actually really, really important, right? We're getting kind of off on a tangent here. Before I get too much into the customization aspect, if we were talking about extending, there's another one in here too I didn't even think of, which is customizable difficulties. PvP, so milestone for PvP, in which we basically discussed the same thing we just did now, which is adding the aspect of Left 4 Dead style gameplay into Helldivers 2. Also applies to Space Marines 2, where you have people that would then take control of the major units and maybe even minor units if they wanted to do that. You could have like Skulks if you've ever played, that's kind of what the small units are. If you've ever played, not Aliens vs. Predators, old game. What is it called? It used to be a mod for Half-Life 2, and then they turned it into a game, Natural Selection 2. Other game, by the way. Oldie but coolie game with asymmetrical sides. Very cool game from a balancing perspective and just a gameplay perspective too. But they could do that if they wanted to. They could add the Left 4 Dead aspect to Space Marines 2, if they wanted to. But PvP as it stands right now, I think is DOA. It is not something that has really any... It's not going anywhere. And you could try really hard to make it good, like maybe it might just turn into a Gears of War, and some people are really into that, but I think they're just going to play Gears of War. So I really don't think it's ever actually going to turn into anything. PvE, on the other hand, is an experience. And what you'll see first and foremost in their roadmap here is that cosmetics are first and foremost. Do cosmetics matter? Yes, they do. And as we just talked about, do they matter a lot? Sure they do. And is it something they should keep turning out? 100%. But is it something that is going to make people continue to play your game? I don't think so. I think at this point there's a lot of cosmetics in the game, and I think they should still add them. However, adding more cosmetics to the game I don't think is going to make people want to play the game again. The thing that really, really matters right now is the gameplay loop, and people, myself included, which I didn't even plan on playing the PvE co-op, the PvE operations for any length of time, except for the fact that basically I just didn't want to play World of Warcraft. And now I still really don't want to play World of Warcraft tonight, although at this point I got enough knowledge together here where we can give a pretty accurate overview of the game and basically what it's lacking, which is the gameplay loop. The gameplay loop in Space Marines 2 is pretty poor, meaning once you play a mission, you can only do it like 6 or 7 times before it starts getting really competitive. There's currently 6 maps in the game. And unfortunately, we had to play Inferno for half of our games when the game first came out. For some reason, that they're putting, I don't know why everyone was playing Inferno, but they were, and it was really boring. I'd say the chaos, so the other three of the missions were already underplayed, mainly due to the fact that they're already really difficult. The most recent patch has toned that down, so now a lot of people are playing Chaos Marines because it's different, and it's a different experience, right? But in general, what you'll notice is the missions are actually relatively boring. I believe this is in line with Darktide and with Vermintide. I played Vermintide. which is occasionally they release a new mission. As you can see on the roadmap here, you have a PvE mission, which once again PvP doesn't matter. PvE mission, I don't even know, the sparring arena I think was just something they could do. I don't think a lot of people are going to use it. PvE missions, PvE mission, so 1. This is plural, so maybe 2. New enemy, also important. In the case of Helldivers 2, we talked about that extensively. You need new units to engage with. The difference, obviously there's a lot of differences between Helldivers 2 and Space Marine 2, and I criticize people for trying to make them directly equivalent to each other because, oh, people are just going to play Space Marine 2 instead of Helldivers 2. They're very, very different games. The difference, and the big difference with a lot of games like this that have kind of really cool mechanics, but they don't really have a good gameplay loop, is they offset it with procedural generation. In the case of Helldivers, or not Helldivers 2, Helldivers 2 does have procedural generation, and I'd say the only reason that it's actually able to play Helldivers 2 for 6 months was because they're procedurally generated maps. They're always different. Even if it's the same stuff reorganized in different areas, and every time we found a new tile or a new module, we pointed out that they're basically making up the maps of, or they reorganize how the density of the maps and change them. A lot of stuff we talk about basically before anyone else, any other streamers would talk about it because they didn't notice it. Especially in the first month, I like pointing out that basically I was the only one to notice the tiles were changing when everyone else was legit just, they had no idea what was going on. Because once again, they didn't talk about everything in the patch notes. A lot of people are patch note Andes, to steal a Zoomer term, patch note Andes, where they'll just read off the patch notes, think that's all that happens, and then don't really process anything outside of it because they think that's all they have to do. And that's not really the way it works. But anyways, in the case of Helldivers 2, the procedural generation loop added a lot to the game. It made it very, very different. Even if the first biomes, and they're starting to change now, the biomes that it first came out with were just kind of all rebland, recolors of each other with different environmental effects on top of each other, like weather, and basically just toning down the amount of visibility in an area, right? Toning down the amount of visibility in an area and stuff that you otherwise, maybe not take for granted, but it's not really adding much. The new biome that they added in June, I think it was, with Dagobah. I call it the Dagobah biome, which is the swamp biome, which almost looks like Dagobah. In the case of the Dagobah biome in June, they tacked that on there and it actually added a lot because it drastically changes it. Earth in general has a lot of different biomes, and it very much changes the kind of gameplay you are fighting in. It actually matters a lot. Biomes matter a lot. But in the case of Helldivers 2, procedural generation starting out with actually changed and made things much more interesting, even if it was very basic at the beginning. In the case of Space Marines 2, I do not expect them to make an open world map like Helldivers 2 with a bunch of objectives in it in the same way as Helldivers 2. I don't think that is on the table. The thing that they currently have slated that might really change things up, but I don't think so, is a Horde mode. And this is all the way in Season 4 after all this stuff is added to the game. Horde mode, as far as I understand it, is just the last stand. It's like COD Zombies. Could it work in this game? Yeah, will some people play it? For sure. Is it something I really think is actually something that is meaningful? I don't think so. Horde modes generally do not have an end to them unless, it's just endless for the most part. I mean, it can, in the case of Killing Floor 2, it can have ends to it if you set it up that way, right? But I think just fighting off enemies isn't really, it doesn't make you feel accomplished when you are doing it. It still is fun, and I enjoy a good Horde game, don't get me wrong. One of the reasons I'm playing Space Marines 2 and Helldivers 2. But in the case of just fending off endless mobs of enemies, it becomes repetitive as well. In the case of Helldivers 2, they have a Horde mode, but on top of the procedural generation with objectives that make you feel accomplished at the end, even though it's basically kind of almost a Horde mode. And the Horde mode is what I would actually say would make a huge difference in the game itself. It's way over there on the right side. So in Season 4, arguably, if this is based on quarter or maybe half, so the later half of 2025, we might see a Horde mode. That's way too late for the game. The game's going to fall off well before then. This should have already been way over here. This should have been something they're working on right now. Do new missions matter? Yes. Does PvP game mode matter? I don't think so. Do the cosmetics matter? To a certain extent, but there's already a lot of cosmetics in the game itself. What's going to stop people from playing the game, and I don't think this is nearly the same sort of game that, like, let's say, not Starfield, Star Citizen is, where you're just showing off your NFTs in the game itself. They could eventually do that, but right now you have to have a game that people want to play for a prolonged period of time to then show off their cosmetics. Right now, as I've mentioned a couple different times while we were playing the game, the cosmetics are very lackluster, or not cosmetics, the gameplay, the loop is very lackluster compared to the cosmetics itself. Like, the cosmetics are first and foremost, they're clearly trying to show it off. I criticize the game for actually not having custom animations, because people love that shit, even if they're buying it. There's a lot of opportunity here, depending on how long this isn't, I don't believe this game is advertised as a service, and technically with Vermintide and Darktide, what they generally do is do like seasons, which you can see right here, and then they basically end production, and then they start Space Marine 3. In this case, I don't even think they need to do that, and do they need to make a Destiny? No. But procedural generation, which isn't even a Horde mode, should be something they're looking at. And while the PvE missions are pretty cool because they're tailored campaign, story-based experiences, when it comes to long-term replayability, this does not last. These are still important, and I'd definitely say they should keep making these. But what they should be doing instead of a Horde mode, or maybe in lieu of a Horde mode, or they could even do it with a Horde mode, depending on how they're balancing their internal assets, is they should be doing a procedurally generated mode. And they don't need to have an open world environment, as I mentioned before. It does not need to be Helldivers 2. But if you can imagine something like Binding of Isaac, where you have multiple nodes or modules that are interconnected to each other in areas that you then go through and then changes elements. And if they already have a little bit of procedural generation or just randomness in the game itself, which is loot spawns, crate spawns, the wave spawns, there's a little bit of a, what they used to call it's just basically a script, but in Left 4 Dead, they called it the director, right? A little bit of an element to the background, which they 100% could beef up and make better, by the way. They have a director operating in the background that chooses when it sends mobs at you and how many mobs it sends at you, and there is some variability in that and what kind of enemies you show up there, and that changes what shows up later and earlier in the match, right? Later on or earlier, and kind of weighs and balances stuff. That does add a lot of replayability to the game, and if they didn't have it itself, it 100% would have made things much worse off. But it needs to have more of a procedural generation. That will keep people playing their game, because the mechanics, the slaughter, the gameplay is pretty good. The loop is not very good, and they need to improve on the loop. And PvE missions are a new loop. It's a new place to play through, right? But it, once again, these only last for about 6 or 7 times through it before people really just kind of, yeah. There's no surprises. Well, I mean, sometimes like the director can change things up. There's no surprises. It doesn't really change things. There's no real kind of weird quirkiness to it, or, you know, finding like a hidden area that's, you know, rare, or stumbling upon like a loot room, or, you know, going through a couple really heavy areas before you get to another area, you know, like changing things up enough where it's actually a different scenario each and every time. And once again, it does not need to be Helldivers 2. It needs to be a scenario where people can continually play this game for a prolonged period of time. And this, all the way over there, these just along the way, and at the end of Q4, in the end of 2025, having a Horde mode, which will probably just be some sort of COD Zombies, is not going to cut it. If they really want people to continue to play their game, and once again, they can add all the cosmetics in the world. They can add, you know, even missions. If they only add one new mission, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to play the mission, you play it once again like 5 times. How many hours of gameplay is it? Like 4, maybe 3? And then you're done again, right? They need to have procedural generation in their game itself. And I'd say that, and I know it's more complicated than that, but at the end of the day, if you've played Hades, or once again Binding of Isaac, even Helldivers 2, although it's an open world and has procedural generation, it is entirely possible to do it with games like this to make areas feel exciting, inviting, different, interesting, and a different experience each time, which is what keeps people coming back. Because there is no PvP where you're butting heads with, well, they could add it, which we covered earlier. There's no PvP where you're butting heads with people. The game itself needs to change, or it needs to offer different ways of playing it, and it doesn't. As it currently stands right now, it doesn't. And this is putting aside all the balancing concerns, because there's a lot of them in the game. Where we could cover that, that's more nitpicking on, not really nitpicking, but I'd consider a level lower in terms of what matters in the game itself, because people have to want to play the game more than then start worrying about the balancing issues. You have to get past the idea that there isn't any procedural generation in the game itself. There's nothing that actually keeps you playing in the first place to keep you coming back to the game itself. You're just loading it up and going, oh, I'm playing this mission for the nth time. I'm already sick of Inferno once again, because for some reason it was bugged, or people were only playing Inferno for the first week of the game, which was pretty insane. I can't emphasize enough that this is too late, and I don't think this is even the right way of looking at things. They should be looking at procedural generation, and it should even take precedence if they have to, you know, if they have only so many resources to spend. Procedural generation should take precedence over everything on this list. There needs to be a way for people to continue to play the game without getting bored of it, so then they can like the cosmetics in the game. Because if they get bored of it, they quit. It doesn't matter how good the game looks, because it looks really good. Don't get me wrong, the game looks fantastic. By the way, in the latest patch, I complained about the being too blurry, and then I think they added a sharpening to it. They sharpened the scenes instead, which then just made things look over sharpened now. So that's a completely unrelated thing. I saw it the other day. I was like, this looks really kind of fizzy or crackly is the best way. Like if you turn into a channel, if you've had a CRT TV, you know, you get the static on it. That's what over sharpening reminds me of, is where it gets staticky. And now instead of blurring, you have crackling, and it's also not where you want to be. I don't know why they have to keep applying filters and stuff, but they do. Unrelated, but anyways, over the top of this list, I would say procedural generation. If they want people to continue playing their game, they should 100 and buy their DLCs and buy their season passes. They should 100% look into procedural generation for their game itself. It doesn't need to be an open world environment. It could be partially open world, but they need to have a changing experience where you're playing a mission and it's not just the same thing over and over and over again, because that gets boring really fast for most people. So, difficulty, is even new difficulty in Helldivers 2. I really want a difficult experience, and it can be very difficult in Space Marine 2, although when you get to 25 it definitely gets a lot easier, especially if you're playing heavy, which we're going to get to here in a second, which is the juxtaposition and the woes of ranged versus melee, which we've talked about a couple different times on stream. Lethal difficulty, will this add replayability? Sure it will, but once again, you're going to be playing the same 6 missions over and over again, maybe 7 in the last part of this year. You'll have another mission, right? Is that going to change everything? No. And is it going to keep people playing the game? It might not even be enough to bring people back to the game, because they're going to go, oh, it's just one new mission, right? So once again, our mission's cool. I love missions. I love story mode. I love the fact that it's an engrossing campaign, but once you play it 6 or 7 times, there needs to be more to the game to keep people playing your game. And if it's not there, you can have all the cosmetics in the world. You can have the Volkite pistol, which I'm sure some people are clapping their hands about because they're tabletop fans. But if you don't want to continue playing the game because it's actually boring, it doesn't matter if you have all the skins in the world. And once again, the customization system in the game currently is really cool. I haven't even spent any time with it because that's not really my cup of tea. I have a White Scar skin, which apparently is now becoming very popular. I'm not exactly sure why, even though I picked basically the rarest skin I saw. Now becoming very popular. It's not it's not something I'm going to spend a lot of time on in this, particularly because I can't see myself playing this game for any prolonged period of time. We talked about this yesterday, so it's kind of weird. So let's talk a little bit, moving on here, because once again, what really, really matters and what we have to talk about is the procedural generation for long-term outlook of this game. It matters more than everything else on this list. Everything else on this list takes a backseat to procedural generation, because you actually need to be able to go through the loop multiple times without getting bored. That's first and foremost above everything else. Let's talk a little bit about the woes of ranged versus melee. And there is a pretty big stark contrast. Melee in this game is extremely punishing. It's very skill intensive, which I'm not against, by the way. But the weird thing about this game is it takes so much time to actually get good at it. You're bored of the missions, you're bored of going through the same loop before you even master your class, master the aspects of the game, because you're playing the same 6 missions over and over again. Melee in this game is very difficult, mainly because the debate windows with the parries, with the unblockables getting stuck in animation, which I don't know why more people don't talk about that, but getting stuck in animation is why you die a lot of times. Or you go for a heavy swing, mainly with the fast weapons, like specifically, let's use the Warhammer, the biggest offender. You'll go for a heavy swing, and then the guy will actually trigger, whatever you're fighting will trigger an unblockable, an unparryable attack while you're mid-swing, and you can't roll. It doesn't matter if you react to it, you physically can't roll. The key doesn't work, it doesn't do anything. You can parry, you can execute out of a heavy swing, but you cannot roll, you cannot dodge, so you just eat the damage despite the fact that you started a swing prior to seeing the unblockable attack, and you lose to it because it's still going and you can't dodge. You can, however, parry and then dodge, which the parry cancels your swing, and then so you can use animation cancel. You parry cancels your swing and then you roll. I don't have it down to perfection or whatever, but you can 100% do it. We've tried it; it works. However, it's backwards and not something that should happen in the first place. You also cannot quick shot. The quick shot icon appears after you go into another attack, which then means that oftentimes you won't actually be able to respond to it. You'll, let's say, especially if you're in a heavy swing, if you go into a heavy swing while you're quick attacking, or heavy swing, and you see the quick shot icon pop up after you start swinging because the game lags, you can't cancel your heavy swing to then quick shot. You probably parry, which I haven't done, you could probably parry then quick shot, but what it means is, so animation cancel again, what it means is you do something, which then, like, if you melee, which isn't always consistent, mind you, you melee enemy units and you knock them away, and then one of them you can quick shot, but you go into a heavy swing because you don't see any of the icons pop up right away after you knock them away. That means you then lose out on an armor piece, which when you're in melee is incredibly important. It's incredibly, absolutely fucking important that you are able to quick shot to get your armor back. And regardless of what people said that quick shot doesn't have iframes. The iframes are not for the full duration. There's a spot at the beginning and the end in which you will take damage. It's too short. But there is definitely a spot in between where you won't take damage. The enemies back off, which is a sign they can't attack you. And I've legit seen enemies lunge into me and not do damage to me in the middle of the quick shot, where they'll just like fall off your screen. So there's 100% iframes in quick shot. It's just not the full duration, which is why you get hit at the beginning and the end of it. You can get knocked out of it right when you're starting the attack. But right in the middle, there's definitely iframes. It's 100% iframes in it. That aside, once again, quick shot is incredibly important because you need to be able to respond and get armor back, which keeps you alive. When you're playing melee, you need the armor back to stay alive. And because the game is, once again, one of the problems and why it's so punishing in melee, despite the fact that it's not actually, it's not that much reward. So risk-reward, right? In the case of melee, it is extremely punishing. You have enemies flying at you constantly. You have to constantly go through your QD keys, QD events of, dodge, parry, quick shot, being able to respond to everything, and then at the same time trying to get some damage in on top of it. And then at the end, you'll realize that you pull maybe 11,000 damage. Meanwhile, heavy and tactical are pulling 15 to 25,000. I had a 26,000 game as heavy yesterday while playing with the Melta off stream. I don't even have the artifact Meltas yet. I'm on purples right now. I had a 25k game against Tyranids. I believe it was on Inferno at the end of the game. And when you play when you play melee, no one climbs basically above 11k. It doesn't matter how much you do and how much damage you're mitigating, you just don't get the numbers back for it. So even when you're doing things perfectly in an extremely punishing system, which honestly the only upside to melee is it looks really cool. Once again, cosmetics being ahead of the actual gameplay, mechanics, the loop itself, and just much better than everything else. But you don't realize when you're looking at it, it looks really cool. But in reality, when you're playing it, you realize you're getting tossed around constantly and fucked with. And there's almost nothing you can do. We talked about the extensive nature where basically when you get past like 2 attacks, so like let's say a light and heavy attack, one after another in a chain, there's a bunch of like the Gauntlet, the Chainsaw Sword, the War Maul. There's a bunch of attacks that you take more time than that, but what you'll realize is you'll either run into a quick shot, a parry, or an unblockable attack where you have to move, or your character gets stuck in the case with the Gauntlet and doesn't move forward, so then you just miss your next hit. In which you won't use attacks past the first 2. You won't. And on the hardest difficulty playing on Ruthless, you end up in a case where you'll almost never use those. This is putting aside Rapid Succession, which is another, I'm getting too much in the balance here, but Rapid Succession, another unutilized perk, mainly because the requirements are too stringent, the time isn't enough. And then you have perks that, for instance, will give you a bonus, but only lasts like 5 seconds, but the game itself is relatively slow, and it takes a ridiculous amount of time to kill a lot of units. 5 seconds isn't nearly enough. That's what she said. And it needs to be much longer than that. Once again, so we're talking about all these in-depth things that you have to manage, the niggles, animation canceling with doing melee, but then you can just play ranged and deal 15 to 25,000 damage. I did 15,000 damage with a Gray Melta, comparably to something that is very, very skill-based. And once again, I like playing melee. I think it's engaging, but it's so punishing, and then there's a lot of nuances too, like let's say someone flies at you for a parry, they land next to you, and you don't even get to parry on them. Makes no sense. Sometimes the parry will be desynced with the server, where you'll actually hit the parry key and it just won't go off properly, which is very, very punishing once again, because if you miss your parry, either because you missed the window or something doesn't actually go in for an attack that you're supposed to parry, you sit there with your dick in your hand holding your parry up and basically miss out on a window to apply CC, to apply knockback to enemies, to get them out of the way in order to be able to actually do damage, to actually be able to deal with the mob itself. And you sometimes will end up in a negative, I don't know what to call it, a negative chain, in which the enemies will be attacking you, but like you can't actually get you legit have to either back off or just eat damage for basically one rotation to actually get through it. So yeah, like it just doesn't make sense. Melee in this game, I see what they're trying to do with it, but a lot of it seems like, as we discussed last night, it seems an awful lot like the person that was directing, that came up with the Melee system, like looked at Mordhau or Chivalry 2 and was like, this is pretty fucking cool, right? But then they didn't take into account the fact that you're basically getting attacked by 10 units at the same time, and it's not a 1v1 anymore. Can you kind of 1v1? Yeah, if you're like 1v1ing a boss, or maybe even then sometimes you can't. A boss or a major unit, you can 1v1 them, and it kind of works out, putting aside the jankiness, which we just covered. Kind of works out, but when you start throwing in all the fodder units, it doesn't make sense. A lot of what's going on in the game, the Melee system was not designed for a horde game. It was designed for a 1v1 Mordhau experience, and that's not really what the game is. And I think there should be skill involved with it, and I think it should excel at skill and actually be much more skillful, or much more rewarding for people that are good at Melee, because it's harder than ranged. But there isn't really, you don't do the numbers. Even when you're doing well, you still don't do the numbers. Meanwhile, you can trout around as ranged and just obliterate everything. Play tactical and just dump out a shitload of frag grenades, for instance. There's a lot of ways you can literally just dump out DPS as ranged with almost none of, or very limited risk. And that's not the way a risk-reward curve should work, right? And I definitely do think, once again, we aren't going to get too much into the nitty-gritty of balancing, but in terms of risk-reward, range needs to have a DPS nerf, and melee needs to have a DPS buff. And maybe even when a really good ranged player, or excuse me, a really good melee player should be able to over-excel and do a lot more numbers than a ranged player can. You are paying for the privilege of a reduced risk curve. And it makes a lot of sense if you actually, believe in risk-reward and believe people should be rewarded for skill. Ranged, unless you're talking about poking eyeballs, and even then, like, the amount of keys you're pushing as melee is completely different than ranged, and it doesn't remotely make sense. And I understand that you still want to have an engaging experience, and maybe they should just leave ranged where it is in terms of DPS numbers, and then just super buff melee to bring them up. If I can't pull 25,000 with a Warhammer, yeah, if I can't pull 25,000 with a Warhammer, then what exactly am I doing with a Warhammer? You just play Bulwark. Bulwark, in my personal opinion, is one of the most OP classes in the game. It has nothing to do with the fact that you pulled ridiculous numbers. You can do the same numbers as other you can do the same numbers as other melee, such as Assault, only you don't die, ever, as it turns out, and that's actually really, really, really powerful. That's just, once again, just completely putting aside the fact that ranged isn't, like, it just, you don't have to do the amount of work. You just pull the trigger and that's it. There isn't really much to it. And I'd say actually, like, playing Plasma was actually much more skillful than playing Melta. And you could add mechanics to the classes themselves to make it so there's skill expression involved in it too. Such as Melta, you have to line up units, and Plasma, you have to charge it up and lead the targets. Although they increase the projectile flight speed, which, once again, if there's more skill involved with it, then you can add more damage to it, right? But some things that are really, really low skill-based, shouldn't be doing the numbers that they're doing. But in the case of the game right now, you can pull ridiculous numbers just by spamming grenades with tactical, and that doesn't really make sense. That's just kind of one of the major niggles I had with the game, because when I first played the game, the weird thing is when I played through the campaign, I didn't play Operations right away. I played through the campaign right away. It was pretty clear that the melee system in the game was pretty borked. It was pretty messed up. And the shitty thing about it, it's very punishing to learn the melee system in this game. Once again, you can spend a bunch of hours doing it, but it comes back to the gameplay loop and basically how you're stuck in 6 missions. So you have to spend all this time learning how to play melee well, and then you find out that basically you're bored of the game while you're still learning how to play the class, because it requires that much knowledge. And once again, with melee, it's very debatey, because what you don't realize is sometimes you'll even get hit by attacks even after you roll out of them. But sometimes parry attacks won't go off properly. We're circling back to what I was talking about earlier. But in the case of melee, the parry window is one of the biggest, not concerns, but one of the biggest gripes I have with the game, was not accurate. Like, you think you see the parry window, right? You see the green pop up, and then you hit the key a certain amount afterwards. What actually the game doesn't tell you is the parry window just pops up to warn you that an impeding attack is coming up. It is not timed. So what happens is you have to know the mob and you have to know the window to then parry the attack. And that actually is very misleading. You think that the parry window is going to be the same amount of time after the green blinks, right? The light goes on, you push the button, the monkey gets his treat, right? And in the case of this game, the light turns on, and then there's a window, and you have to figure out the length of the window, which depends on a couple different things here. It depends on what kind of weapon you're using. It depends on the type of block it has for it, block, fencing, balance, right? The type of block it has for it, which changes the window even further. And then on top of it, you have to know right after the parry window blinks that this enemy is now going to attack you, which is different for each one of the enemies. It's a lot of I don't want to say illogical, but a lot of the skewed things all happening in tandem with each other that leads to a very, very unfulfilling experience, very frustrating experience for someone first playing this game. And it's still there in the game right now, but I've played it enough where I kind of actually getting a feel for things that are going on. This is putting aside desync and putting aside server issues, which we had like last week when they're updating, which is really, really janky. I was just missing stuff that I've always hit, like the green orb thing, the pulsing green thing on the bosses, because the servers in the back end were being hammered with update material, is my guess, in the background. This they can all fix. They can improve on it, and not only improve on the quality of life of the melee system itself, but then also give the reward for melee, whether or not they want to bring the melee DPS up to range DPS numbers, or if they want to drop the DPS numbers down, which is probably better. But if they're adding a newer difficulty, maybe they're balancing around range damage. Either way, as it stands right now, range is just where you want to go. You can pull the huge numbers with ranged and with very little risk. And with DPS, or with melee, you can't really do the same thing. Even when you're doing well, you can't do the same thing. It just doesn't happen. All your animations take too long. You're stuck on target, and that's putting aside the fact that you have to deal with the melee. You can't do the long chains of attacks. With the gauntlet or with the hammer, just trying to power it up to do like the seismic slam means you're just going to eat a boatload of damage and get like none of it back. You're going to swing the hammer and get like none of it back, as opposed to just doing normal CCs and normal, like maybe a pommel strike into a heavy attack, right? The numbers aren't there. It just doesn't support it. You think you're going to do a lot and you just don't, and then you eat a boatload of damage along the way. There's almost no ways to get health back. It's extremely, extremely punishing, which is the way you have to get it back is with a quick shot. But once again, you're in a heavy swing. You can't quick shot. Although thinking about that like earlier, I should probably parry to cancel my heavy swing and then quick shot, which actually would probably just work, because animation canceling, once again, which shouldn't be in a well-developed game, shouldn't actually be a thing. Animation canceling is usually a sign of a broken system that people are trying to get around. But anyways, podcast tonight, guys, I really wanted to cover a long-term look at this game. And one of the reasons that, this didn't, personally for me, guys, this game did not feel like $60. Cosmetically, it feels like a $60 game, but the loop and the gameplay itself is not there at a $60 game. It was maybe a $30 or $40 game. Cosmetically, it's a really, really well-designed game from a cosmetic standpoint, but from the gameplay standpoint, which is what keeps you playing the game itself, it's not. And this is all these things, the lethal difficulty isn't going to change anything, to be perfectly honest. I mean, this is nice, but you have to have a loop that people want to play in the first place to then appreciate higher difficulty, right? Skins, great, and everything. That's something that the tabletop fucks all want. The tabletop nerds love that shit. Am I against skins? No, I think actually it's a really cool part of the game. But people have to want to play the game, and adding one PvE mission at the end of this year and one PvE mission in the first half of next year is not going to be enough to keep this game going. It's just not. Maybe at the end of this, periodically people will come back and just play the updates, but ideally you want them to continually play your game, right? To then buy the season pass, to buy the DLC, to buy cool cosmetics that you might pop out that are exclusives. There's a lot of monetary aspects that they could potentially do with this game if they really wanted to. If you know anything about the tabletop game, the tabletop is extremely expensive, and it's one of the reasons I don't play it. I know friends in high school that played it, and they spend all their money on it. They had like absolutely no money, and they'd always just complain about the prices. That being said, like people love like it's really 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 fucking cool. Oh, another thing I want to hit on here prior to us ending the podcast section here, guys. It's really 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 fucking cool seeing like your unit actually playing through the game, and there's little like the elevators are perfect for animations, by the way. They don't have any custom animations. There's no doodads or moving around or doing a little shuffle or whatever in the elevator itself, or uncomfortable dialogue. There is some uncomfortable dialogue, but putting that aside, one of the coolest things about Dawn of War, I will say this prior, and we talked about last night, one of the coolest things about Dawn of War is the philosophical bullshit. It is everything they spout in combat, their righteous zealotry towards whatever they believe in, and how they're willing to accomplish it. Right? Just like a Stardust, like the YouTube series prior to Warhammer taking it out for whatever reason. A Stardust, like that sort of level of severity and zealotry, like what do you even call it? Perseverance, fervor. That amount of fervor towards an endless war goal is actually really cool. The lines in Dawn of War, if you want a cool throwback, Dawn of War is a really old game, so it's like 20 years old at this point. So it is obviously hasn't aged extremely well. The two coolest things, which even today Warhammer games try to perpetuate, the two coolest things, even today the developers, you can tell when they've watched it and perpetuate through like modern gaming, is the absolute ridiculous voice lines, and then also not the sure kills, but the animation syncs. So the animation sync kills. Dawn of War had an absolute ridiculous boatload of animation sync kills. And they're all really well done. It's, obviously the graphics are old and the models are old and everything, but the animations were really, really, really well done for their time. And once again, in this game, you can see they try to do the same thing where you have the sync kills, right, with executes. The sync kills, which are, a rewarding aspect to a fight well done for the most part, although sometimes depending on what you want iframes to last longer or less. You want faster executes or slower executes depending on what you're doing. It's actually one of the really, really cool aspects of the game, and I really hope they add more voice lines to the game, because that's actually one of the things that draws you in. It sounds when you first play a Warhammer game, guys, especially if you play Dawn of War, it sounds very spammy, but once you get used to it, you actually really, really enjoy, basically, the noises of battle, right? They really, really, really enjoy it. And it's not really in the game right now. It's kind of there, but voice lines, if you've played Hades, you know how much dialogue matters, and dialogue matters an absolute boatload. But this is, once again, in kind of lieu or to the side of having a gameplay loop that works. First and foremost, prior to all this kind of like sub-level stuff, I would say, in terms of, new PvE missions, which are like story. This is not even PvE missions. New story missions. This is new story missions. Let's set that straight first. You're playing a story mission. You're not playing a PvE experience. It's because it's the same thing over and over and over again, right? New story missions, which are pretty cool. Don't get me wrong, they're pretty cool. First and foremost, what really, 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 really matters in this game is they need to have procedural generation, and I'm not talking about it's going to magically make a story mode, but rather you need to have something like Binding of Isaac, Hades, even Helldivers 2 does it too, but they do it on a much bigger scale. Different environments every time you go in, with different elements, with different confrontations and areas you run into stuff in, and different basically modules that are all clicked together in a different order, so then it changes how you go into the battle and how you change stuff, right? That matters more than anything here, because if people stop playing the game, it doesn't matter if you had one story mission, if you add a skin, and then you add difficulty for stuff that no one wants to play anymore. It doesn't matter. All this stuff doesn't really fucking matter. What really, 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 really matters, and the only thing here on this list that might actually change it is Horde mode. My guess is this is going to be a COD Zombies experience, which is not procedural generation. That's not specifically what I'm talking about. But we have to specifically talk about this because, once again, I haven't planned on playing Space Marine 2 for as long as I have, and it's partially because I was bored of other games, but also at the same time, it's kind of like more of I'm a very driven person when it comes to personal internal mechanics, I guess you could say. So like mastering stuff, I really, really enjoy. I like the sense of autonomy that it offers. And melee system in the game is very complicated, despite the fact there's very little reward for doing so. It's very complicated and cosmetically very fulfilling, right? So, yeah. Let's see. If you can't put over 100 hours into a game, you're not a true gamer. True. Thanks for the likes, guys. This game is a multiplayer game. Yes, it is. Yeah, I am going to say, so once again, games graphically will age like, like fucking milk. They'll age like fucking milk. Eventually they turn into cheese and yogurt. But, graphics, Dawn of War 1, from a gameplay standpoint, is, like, the gameplay is pretty cool. They could actually remaster Dawn of War 1 if they wanted to. Dawn of War 1, like, graphics are just ass at this point. Obviously, there's a lot of quality of life updates since then in terms of RTSs in general. But the coolest fucking part of the game was the absolute philosophical bullshit that just fucking yelled constantly while running into combat and just doing random shit. It was just so over the top. And it would depend on what's happening now, if their morale's broken, if their morale's above normal, if they have the enemy on the run, if they're being pushed back, if they're losing. There's all different sorts of voice lines. And a lot of them were really, really, really well done. You're right, yeah. Like, the original voice actors were extremely well done. Extremely well done. And it really goes to show that stuff is timeless because there is no graphics for voices, right? You say something in a certain way, you add your tone, your, what is it called? Your mannerisms. There's another word for it, Duxter? There's a word for it, but basically how you assemble your sentences and the amount of, projection that you use, basically how you sound, can drastically change voice lines. And one thing, assuming the audio quality is all right, which it is, it's a timeless experience. There's nothing that can have it. And the voice lines in Space Marines, Dawn of War 1 was very good. Space Marines 1 was also very good. Graphically, not that great. I played it on stream. That was a long time ago. Played it on stream. We played through it mainly because I like Warhammer, but not necessarily like super great game. It was actually after Relic went under, and it was actually surprising that Space Marines 2 actually came out. I think Relic went under, and then someone else made a new Relic, or Relic basically became another company or something like that. But, yeah. And... ban? Bye. Yeah, fucking weird. Absolutely fucking weird. Just absolutely timeless experience. I think it would have been better to have World Bearers or Black Legion somehow linked to Emirates Warband. So at one part in, like, when we were going to the Ziggurat underground, I actually thought that it was a teaser for Chaos, or not Chaos, for Necrons. They could add a lot of, like, really cool teasers for Tau and Necrons. By the way, there's a lot of... Dawn of War has some really cool fucking races in it, guys, and Necrons... pretty fucking cool. Tall, pretty fucking cool, right? And yeah, there's a lot of opportunity where they could actually add that into the game as teasers, even if the races aren't there. As you know, with Helldivers 2, they don't really have stuff that's complete when they're still teasing it, because they know that you could just kind of hook people on the idea of something. That's all you really need. But once again, you can do all the cosmetic stuff in this game you want, but what really, really matters and what keeps people playing this game is the gameplay loop. And prior to any of this, I would actually put all hands on deck for procedural generation for this game. And not a horde mode, procedural generation. So if you can imagine the way you have PvE missions now, obviously it won't be story-based because it'll just be random gibberish. But, well, depending on how they do it. But this horde mode really should be all the way up here, and it should be procedural generation PvE, like it's PvE mission mode. Is basically what it should be. So you actually have a chance to play new and exciting experiences every time, and then they could add new biomes on top of it, where it changes kind of the weather and what's happening, which there is already weather and whatever that one is with, I think it's the train one, right? Where you go through the areas and you have sandstorms, more or less, right? But you need to have that so people actually want to stay interested in. The cosmetics are really cool, and I would actually say the best part of the game is the cosmetics, as we've talked about before. Cosmetics are the best part of the game, but people need to have a reason. This isn't shit. Not Outlaw Star. What the fuck? Starfield, Outlaw Star. Star Citizen, the other fucking game. This isn't Star Citizen where they're selling their NFTs. You need to have a reason to play the game, guys. And people are already sick of the missions. You know, they can only play it maybe 6 or 7 times before they're sick of it. And there isn't a lot keeping them coming back and wanting to play the game. And it doesn't matter what kind of skins you have in the game or what factions you have represented or whatever. But, yeah. Thanks for the follows, guys. Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff they can do with Warhammer. I've talked about this before. Let's completely put aside Space Marines 2. Space Marines 2, Dawn of War, completely put aside these games. Warhammer is an IP with, 300 plus books for it. It is absolutely lore heavy as fuck and really, really cool. You can actually tell on Twitter, like all the tourists that are basically showing up at the Warhammer universe because they just found out about it. And honestly, my personal opinion, 40k is much cooler than Warhammer. I think Warhammer was just V1, and 40k is actually the best version of Warhammer. Personal opinion on that. But yeah, like, it is an absolutely engrossing experience, and there's absolutely more than enough lore and material for them to build upon. More material for them to build upon, and it's basically already written for them. There are tons and tons and tons of Warhammer 40k games over the years. There's tons of them. Almost all of them they're bad. I'm just going to straight out say a lot of them are just shit. They just suck. You can tell that people are really, really interested in the Warhammer universe, and they try to make a game. But as it turns out, they really can't make a game, and that's happened multiple times over the past. It's probably one of the better Warhammer games that are out there that ever emerged. It was probably Space Marines 2. Space Marine 1, as I mentioned, I played through it. It was all right. You swung a hammer, you ran around as Titus. It was actually, it was a good Warhammer experience, but is this something where I'd be like, yeah, this is like groundbreaking? No. This is probably one of the first games where it actually represents like a AAA experience. But the thing is, the gameplay loop isn't there. They have like classes, which, putting aside, once again, we aren't even hitting on the actual, like, I'd hit on range versus melee in terms of like an overall meta, but not even about all like the perks and everything underneath them, right? That's just noise at this point, because you have to figure out the rest of the game prior to being able to actually tackling the smaller stuff, right? And what really matters here is procedural generation. If this company wants this, like, let's say this to be a service, or I mean, the graphics in this game are phenomenal. This is on an Unreal 5 engine, right? Is this on the Unreal 5 engine? Let me check real quick before I say that. Games are on Unreal 5 now. Space Marines 2 engine. It's probably not. What do they use? The Swarm engine. Oh, did they use something custom? Did they fucking do what fucking Arrowhead did? We used an outdated engine that no one supports anymore. It won't matter anymore because we aren't going to care about our game in 2 years. Engine. Swarm engine. They made a custom engine. By the way, unless you're doing something really, really, really specific. We talked about this extensively with Helldivers 2. Unless you're doing something really, really, really specific, I have no idea why you'd ever want to make your own engine for a game. It's cool from a pride standpoint. We talked before about how people that are very smart are very ideological and think they always make the right decisions because they can do it better. When at the end, they basically put a bunch of effort into something that's suboptimal because it takes a lot of effort to do it, and then they don't want to support it long term because they lose interest in it. It basically becomes a pet project for them. In the case of Space Marines 2, I would not have I think Space Marines 1 was actually on Unreal Engine. In the case of Space Marines 2, I would not have expected them to actually make their own engine for the game. Although it looks like they made it for World War Z. I'm not exactly sure why they would do that, as opposed to paying another company 5% of their revenue, or their sales, 5% of their sales, and basically having all the work done for them, so then they can focus on procedural generation. So people continually play their game, so they don't stop playing the game, so then they can print more money, print more cosmetics, so people want to dress up as a Space Marine for conventions instead of a Helldiver for conventions, right? Although Space Marines have been popular much more before this game was, right? Hence where StarCraft is based on most of this stuff. Yeah, I mean, that's Ice. That's legit. I don't know if you've been here for a while, Ice, but that's we just talked about basically the biggest problem with the game is the fact that there's no procedural generation. It is limited to missions, and the fact that one new story mission is not going to offset the fact that people want to dump, tens of hundreds of hours into your game because it's actually really fucking cool. And all you have going for it is 6 levels that they play through over and over again. I'm not a big fan. I don't want to say a big fan. I'm not a big proponent of always needing to have like new levels. In the case of a PvP game, that's not usually like the end-all be-all of stuff. In PvE, however, you are playing against enemies, and the enemies not only need to be different, but your environment needs to be different, so it feels like you're tackling new and different areas, right? In the case of PvP, people are the new enemies. They're they're the new AI, even though they oftentimes do things. Sometimes they do weird shit because people are fleshy human meat bags that just beep boop in their brain, and yeah, it actually really, really, really matters. Let's see. Think about buying it in a couple weeks. I honestly think is worth it. Angry, I would actually say no at $60. And once again, it's particularly to the gameplay loop. I don't think the campaign is actually really fucking short for if you wanted to buy a game specifically for the single player experience. The campaign is really short. Once again, everything in the game looks really cool because it does. Everything is really, really well made, but once again, it comes down to the gameplay loop and the lack of actual stuff to actually play through. And I would say this is probably a $30 to $40 game right now. The cosmetics, I would say, are much more than $30 to $40, but people actually want to do... This isn't Star Citizen. People want to do stuff with the cosmetics, right? So I wouldn't actually say it's even worth $60 right now. It's actually, after I played through the campaign, I said that actually kind of felt like it has a really good reception. However, when I played through it, it did not feel like a $60 experience, and I wouldn't pay for the $100 of the season pass and whatever, because it's honestly not worth it. Even looking at this, guys. So if I were to base this purely on the roadmap that they have currently assigned, do I feel this is worth $40 to get? Let's see, 2 new story missions, maybe a harder difficulty for the missions I've already played a shitload for. Arenas I'm not interested in. PvP, I don't think PvP in general in this game is gonna, unless they shift it, which we talked about earlier, into a Left 4 Dead experience, which I think would actually work out phenomenally well for this game. PvP, as it stands in this game, trying to do some sort of really kind of crappy version of Gears of War, or just not Halo or Gears of War is not going to work out. The game's not made for PvP, and you can. Just like with World of Warcraft and MMOs, you can absolutely just grind away at it, and it's just you're basically running into a completely different experience that a lot of people aren't even playing your game for. And could they make it much better? They could. 100% could. If you know Left 4 Dead has, it's not necessarily 1v1 sort of experience, team versus team, Space Marines versus Space Marine. It's rather you play the baddies and you try to stop the people from achieving their objective, and maybe you can, but most of the time you can't, but it stops them from using all their time up, and then you can swap sides, and then you try to do it faster and you win, right? There's a lot of ways you can do non-mainstream PvP in games, and I think they're very fitting to Horde-based games because Horde-based games are very different, right? And in the case right now, trying to just tack on Halo, Gears of War, it's not going to do it. This stuff that they have lined up here, I don't think is worth $40. To be perfectly honest, it's not a brand new game in my personal opinion. The season pass is not actually, like, I guess. So I take that back. So the season pass is cosmetics. So all the stuff tacked at that, I thought it was this stuff too. No, so this is free. All the stuff on the bottom here is cosmetic. I thought they're going to add new classes too. New enemy. New enemy. Yeah, I don't actually see anything here for new. I know they're going to add, I think I heard Apothecary. I know they're going to add a new class. Also very important, by the way, for longevity of your game if you plan on this game lasting more than just, like, let's say, spitting out a couple missions and that's it. You need to have longevity there. Classes help a lot with that, right? So it changes how you play through the gameplay loop, but you have to have a different gameplay loop, and that's procedural generation prior to any of it. Yeah, it was actually kind of weird. I thought there's going to be difficulties. I actually dropped down to difficulty because I got stuck on one of the boss fights, and it just was not worth it because the AI would just stand around with their dick in their hand just looking at you while you're getting basically destroyed because everything would focus you too. They just stand there and look at you like the peanut gallery on the sideline. I was like, what the fuck is going on here? One of the worst parts. You get a cam now? I've had a cam for a long period of time. I turned it off after I got COVID, and generally during gameplay I turned it off too, because as it turns out, a lot of people don't even care what you look like for the most part. From what I found is, It's weird. It's kind of basically the opposite direction of what people have said over the years, which is people want to see you on cam. I don't think that's necessarily the case unless you're some sort of beefcake or a VTuber or you're a booba streamer. I honestly, for guys, I don't even think it matters anymore. What matters more is your personality and how you come across. Podcasts, which I used to do a lot, usually involve me talking on cam. And as mentioned before, while we're covering kind of a PSA for this game itself and the long-term outlook for this game itself, I didn't feel it would be right to do it without my cam on, which I do basically for all my podcasts for the most part. So, yeah. No, did he? No. I imagine 2 new enemies will be Orcs and Necrons. Orcs, Necrons, Tau. Tau, I think, is actually a really... That's a good one. I think a lot of people like it. If you look at social media, Tau on social media is actually pretty much hit it out because they're semi-attractive and they're like Drawny or something like that. Yeah, but super futuristic. Also in Dawn of War, if you played that, super futuristic race and pretty cool to play because you wouldn't expect anything to be more advanced than Space Marines, right? It turns out Tau actually kind of are. Tau and Cruder, whatever they're called. Yeah. At a podcast voice, I do. Just has to be something we talk about. Also, my streams, because after I got COVID, guys, my streams have been almost, like, they basically about 3 hours. We normally stream for 5 to 6 hours. There just isn't enough time for me to cover a podcast and play game. I want to play games too, right? And that's partially my fault, but also a lot of stuff in real life kind of dragging me down at the same time. And real life takes precedence. Earning money takes precedence over streaming because streaming doesn't really earn me anything, so... But that being said, guys, I wanted to cover this. At this point, I've played enough of this game, and I actually really, really think they put a lot of effort into this game, and I do feel as though this company wants this game to... It's more than a cash grab. This game company actually wants this game to survive, and I thought it's actually worth my time to give them a sense of direction, and they have a lot of stuff on the roadmap here, but what really, 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 really matters, you can't just do what Vermintide and Darktide did, because it turns out those were very niche games. And honestly, in my personal opinion, they really aren't super amazing. They're good, but they aren't super amazing. And procedural generation, so people can actually enjoy playing, as people in chat were just talking about, procedural generation so you can continue to play the gameplay loop over and over again is actually really, really important. Not just occasional story missions. Story missions are cool. Playing through campaigns are pretty fucking cool, right? Having voiced voice lines, but once again, that also gets old. You can tell people are getting... sick of your 6 missions when they want to turn off the voice lines for the mission because they've heard it 5 million times, the same spot over and over again, right? Just like I don't know why the cinematics plays every time I join it. There's other things, like, there's a lot of weird design decisions, like, why can't you just bypass the cinematics now? Like, I've watched them, like, I have to hit enter every time. Why? Why isn't there just a button after I hit enter twice, I can now bypass them? And then you just put the cinematics in a menu somewhere, like StarCraft or... World of Warcraft, so you can just, click on it or, watch it on YouTube. It really doesn't matter. But after you watch the cinematic twice, at that point, basically, it's redundant. So you should be able to bypass this stuff, but you can't. Yeah. Have a good night, dude. Hope you enjoy your evening, bro. Thanks for stopping by. But yeah, guys, I want to take care of this. I think, once again, just to drive things home, what really matters here, prior to cosmetics, prior to story mode, prior to new classes, all the new classes actually, I'd say, almost matter. I don't say they matter more than procedural generation. I'd say their step below procedural generation is new classes, so it gives people new ways of playing through your game. You need to have procedural generation there so you can have a repeatable experience that does not exist in this game. And once again, it does not need to be a procedurally generated story mode. It just needs to allow people with reorganized tiles, reorganized encounters and areas that you're going through, so it changes everything in the game itself. And it will be a big undertaking, but it matters more than everything else here. And I don't think Horde mode is a procedural generation mode. I think this is like Killing Floor 2. Which, Killing Floor 2 has a lot of gameplay in it, but Killing Floor 2 I don't think does... it does a better job than what Space Marine does in terms of being a Horde game. So, once again, like, if you just had a Horde mode like Killing Floor 2, I don't think this game is currently set up for Horde mode. And they could fix it, sure. But a new... procedurally generated missions would actually just be much, much, much better, and it matters a lot. But yeah, okay, guys. Making content here, I figured we'd take a... we'd talk a little bit about that, because I said we're going to play World of Warcraft tonight, which we didn't do. They want to hang on to their player base, they need to do more than offering a mission. And cosmetics are not going to do it. You know, the new people that play the game will be like, oh, new cosmetic. Actually, they won't even know. It'll just be the new experience. But everyone else playing the game is probably not going to bring them back. They need procedural generation in their game. Okay, let's get all the podcasts here, guys. I do want to play some games tonight. We're going to print this content for YouTube so we can get it up there and maybe get 100 clicks. Not even joking. 100 clicks here.